Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
This is the Schlegel family. A small group of cousins, grandparents, fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. This is the story of one family man's sacrifice to his country. This is the story of how one man helped change the world as we know it.
Hello, I am Christian Schlegel. My occupation is that of being retired. I am a veteran of 3 years in the Army Security Agency.
The Army Security Agency was an exclusive group of men in the United States Signals Intelligence Branch that existed between 1945 and 1976.
My specific role in the Cold War was to learn by radio what the enemy might be planning. And my message would wind up with the National Security Agency. We didn't want any surprises. And my job was to make sure there weren't any surprises.
The Cold War is made up of a series of major conflicts including the Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff between the U.S. and a Soviet Cuba, the closest the world ever got to a full-scale nuclear war. The Hungarian Revolution, an uprising against the Hungarian People's Republic and its Soviet-influenced policies.
President Eisenhower was not supportive of the Hungarian Revolution. If we had gone into Hungary to support the young people in their revolution, the Russians would have come in there with more than tanks. So they were on their own, but I think they did expect some help from us militarily, but they got none, and maybe saved World War III.
The Berlin Blockade, considered the first major crisis of the Cold War, when Soviet powers blocked off Western canals, railways, roads, and access to the democratic sections of Berlin. The Korean War, when the Korean Peninsula split into two control-seeking sovereign states, the United States in the democratic South, and Russia in the Soviet North. The year is 1947. World War II has recently ended, and the world is in turmoil. The United States and her Western allies now face a new threat, a threat that will hang over the heads of millions for nearly half a century. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. The Cold War is unique in the fact that the two major superpowers at the time, the United States and Russia, never came to direct fighting. However, millions of Cuban, Korean, and Vietnamese citizens died at the hands of proxy wars. Many historians argue that the Cold War and the conflicts within it represent the Third World War.
So the Cold War eventually brought down communist rule in Hungary and other European countries. Took a while. Nobody was really shooting at anybody, but nobody trusted anybody. The Russians didn't trust us, we didn't trust the Russians. The Koreans didn't trust us, we didn't trust the Koreans. And in those days, the federal government said, we're going to give you a test. And if you pass this test, all freshman men in 1950, and if you pass this test, you can stay in college for 4 years. In other words, I wouldn't be drafted for 4 years. My college wouldn't be interrupted. And when I graduated, now the decision was, do I want to wait to be drafted because the draft was still on for young men? Or I could enlist for 3 years and get it over with. I was qualified as a teacher then, but I couldn't get a job because the principal or the supervisor or whoever was hiring the person would ask, the first question he asked is, how do you stand with the draft? Well, if I was draft bait, which meant I could be drafted any time, they said no, they weren't really interested in hiring somebody who was draft bait. So what I did was I decided to enlist. We were sort of like, I shouldn't say a spy, but we always knew because we were trained to take code, which meant learning the Morse code, and we always were trained to listen to the enemy. And because we were especially trained to listen to the enemy, we became suspect by the enemy. They wanted to know who we were, what we did, what we knew, and so on and so on. It's sort of an area that I really can't really talk about, except that it was interesting work we did we couldn't talk about, although Time magazine did have an article of the camp where I was stationed and what we did there. And I thought that was interesting. Here we were playing hush hush all these years. Time magazine told the world who we were and what we did. What you might find interesting, and I think I can tell you this story 50 years later, or 60 years later, we had a bunch of guys listening, doing the same job I did. And one of my friends was surprised one night when he intercepted a message that the Russians were sending. And at the end of the message, he said, in code, Merry Christmas. And then he mentioned the call sign, which is the top secret letters of the man copying, my buddy who was copying the message. And we showed this to the superiors there, and they couldn't believe it. In other words, the Russians not only knew where we were and what we did, but they knew who we were. And then it made working there just a little more precarious, because if they knew where we were, they knew how to get to us. The Russians in Hungary were brutal. I mean, their occupation was absolutely brutal. There is a bridge across the Danube River in Budapest, and from these, then there are light standards that lean over into the bridge so that when workers went to work at night or early in the morning, these lights would light up the bridge. Well, what the Russians did to indicate their presence there, they would hang one of what the Russians would call traitors. They would hang them from one of those bridges so that when the workers did go to work, they saw their friends dangling from a rope. Well, these guys dangled from a rope. They were hanged there. They were hanging there by the Russians. And they were brutal. And the next day, they went to work, and there was a different set of bodies hanging from the bridge, hanging from the lights over the bridge. But that was then, but it was an indication of they meant business. They didn't, if somebody fired at one of the tanks, for example, and the tank commanded, what should I do? They're firing at us. And the word was, blow the house down. So even if somebody fired a shotgun and they didn't have military weapons at a Russian tank, they were basically dead, because the Russians would just stop those tanks. Well, they were East Germans, but they were under Russian control. Anyway, those sort of remind me of, they didn't ask questions. They did ask questions. What should I do? They're firing us. Boom. You know, they didn't take them to a court and have a jury decide what they should do. They just blew them away. And we should sort of remember the Russians. They in warfare. They're just brutal.
At the time of Chris's service, President John F. Kennedy has just been inaugurated. Russia's dictator Joseph Stalin has recently died, therefore leading the FBI to round up all remaining communist leaders in the United States. The Korean War has ceased. Had Chris not passed the draft test, it is likely he would have been sent to Korea and died. The world still feels the impacts of the Cold War today. The Cold War ended in 1991 after the tearing down of the Berlin Wall under U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Though relations have significantly improved with Russia, recent allegations of tampering in the 2016 presidential election have thrown the superpower into light again. Tensions with North Korea are ever-changing as new information comes to light. However, President Donald Trump has addressed every breaking development and plans on making peace with the dictatorship. Communism ended in Hungary in 1989, and today the country is thriving.
Well, I have a quote. If we're holding a glass of beer in our hands, and you're holding a glass, and the toast is, here's to you, and here's to me. May our thoughts always agree. But if our thoughts should not agree, to hell to you, here's to me.